take as many POIs and also ask as many POIs as possible. Okay, now we can start the debate, and we would invite to begin the debate the Prime Minister. Okay. So before we come on, I would want to read the motion again, just for clarity purposes. The motion is, this House regrets the concept of South African exceptionalism. Again, this House regrets the concept of South African exceptionalism. Okay. Prime Minister, we're ready for you.
Give me a sec. I'm taking a second to gather my thought. It's fine. I begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. When I first arrived in South Africa, I had the pleasure of meeting a very nice Uber driver who took us around town on the way to get a twin flag, because you people have very weird sockets at the moment. And he said something that has been replaying in my mind since. Speaking about the issue of crime in Johannesburg, he made us understand that the reason that there's so much crime in Johannesburg is not because of structural issues like the cost of living or the housing crisis or unemployment, but because people who go abroad come back into South Africa and bring with them that negative attitude. And this is South African exceptionalism personified. We think that what South African exceptionalism looks like on the ground level is this idea that South Africa is just better. It's not like the other girls. It's better in terms of economics, and that they're doing better in the vague economic senses of GDP and all that. It's doing better in terms of infrastructure, and it's doing better in terms of a culture, i.e. their culture is just something that's so much more valuable than the other cultures that exist in the myriad African states. We think that this is just off the bat something that becomes principally harmful because by virtue of its existence, it's inherently exclusionary. What this means is that to the point where South Africa has to be exceptional, every country else, every culture else has to exist on a level beneath them. We think that you can say this is fine on a very basal level, but when you look at the way that this has translated into real life impacts, you see that it's very, very harmful on that level. But before we get into the real life impacts and my counterfactual, let's do a bit of a history lesson. Why is South Africa exceptional? We think that the reason that they are so, well, let me caveat by saying this. I'm not a South African. I may get some of the facts wrong, but I have a brain and I'm using it for all intents and purposes. We think that the reason South Africa is doing so well economically is not just because they are so much better than everyone else. You have to consider the history of apartheid and the prolonged presence of Europeans within the African country. We think that this becomes very problematic because there are a lot of the economic, betterment comes as a direct result of the exploitative influence that these people had over the country. We think that it's something that you should be regretting for that reason alone, but moving on, it's important that you need to look at how they have tried to metastasize it into something else, talking about how they have emancipated themselves from the clutches of apartheid. This becomes problematic when you look at Africa as a continent, because literally every other African country, bar Ethiopia, had to go through something similar in that they fought off the shackles of colonialism. I come from Ghana. We were the first country south of the Sahara to gain independence from the British. We don't laud it everywhere. We are not saying it makes us better than anyone. I'll take you.
Engage the fact that South Africa is more better in terms of how they are on the people on the ground. People in African countries who are gay are viewed as secondary bodies. We don't see that in South Africa. We've moved away from the deep trenches of colonialism. Engage
I'll engage you now. If you think that it's South African exceptionalism that allows for you to necessarily be more open and have like more liberal views, I think that you've missed the forest for the trees. Understand that what's happening here is not something that's uniquely tied to South African identity, because there's countries all around the world that have been able to like push for equality for different minority groups. We see that happening in Ghana currently, we see that happening in countries all around the world. It has nothing to do with the idea that they are better. Moving on, let's talk about the real nitty-gritty granular impact, how this affects people in the worst way. Let's talk about xenophobia. The problem of xenophobia in South Africa is a massive one. It's been sensationalized massively in the news, but for good reason. They have a problem with the way, that necessarily they perceive foreigners. This is a direct result of South African exceptionalism, because to the point where you have to believe, you are inculcated with the belief that South Africa is better and they can do no wrong, then anything going wrong within your country has to come from the outside. This is why Leroy was saying it's the people that go and stay in the ghettos in other countries that are causing the problems. It's the Namibian scammers that are coming into South Africa with this, the gangs that are coming from other countries, and they are making things so much worse. They fail on the ground level to realize how these issues are caused by structural problems that can be addressed, but the politicians would rather not address them because it becomes so much easier to scapegoat a group of people and make them the cause of your problems and demonize them. We think that on the political level, this translates to policy that is necessarily just flatly bad for a lot of people. I have a friend in UCC. Alia couldn't be here today because her visa was processed really slowly because Alia is Pakistani. We think that to the point where, at the end of the day, what happens at the political level is that these people are treated with a different level of care, with different expectations, whether perceived as a political and economic threat. It translates to them harmfully. But even worse, what it does on the ground level to the lay people is that it allows them to justify the violence that they commit against these foreigners. To the point where the lay people like Leroy and countless other people that think the same as him can scapegoat the Namibians and the foreigners, then what that allows them to do is that for the more radical of them, they have justification to go out and exact their own justice against these people, beating them in the streets, kicking out their businesses, killing them when push comes to shove. Flatly bad. So what is the counterfactual and why is it ultimately better? We think that instead of preaching this narrative of South African exceptionalism, you just preach a stronger narrative of African unity. We think that inherent in African exceptionalism is this idea that South Africa is apart from the rest of Africa, sort of like what Morocco is doing. We think that this is principally harmful because it creates basically a socio-cultural echo chamber wherein thoughts of exceptionalism are allowed to continue to bounce off the walls and then become more radical, and it spills over into xenophobia, but to the point where what you are preaching is a narrative wherein we are all Africans, we have all been through some terrible stuff. Let's hold hands and work together towards building a better future for all of Africa. We think that that's a far better world, and it's a world where you have eliminated mostly xenophobia in that regard. We think that at the end of the day, my partner is going to come and tell you a lot more about how this is going to have impacts on the international relations that South Africa has with other African nations and the international community at large. But for now, what I brought to you is citing analysis on why the narrative of South African exceptionalism has led to the exacerbation and some even creation of one of the biggest problems for South Africa extant in status quo, i.e. the issue of xenophobia, i.e. the issue of scapegoating minorities to allow politicians to continue to rob them blind for all intents and purposes. For all these reasons and more that my partner will bring, proud opening government.
Thank you for the Prime Minister for that speech. It's been the case for the opposition made by the legal opposition here. Please, you hear the bell?
Yes.
Okay, so when you're taking to here, and when your time is up, right again. Who's calling her? Are you anyone?
Hello. Besides the fact that South Africa is progressive in comparison to all the other countries, post-colonial countries, besides the fact that we have functional economies, or the fact that the poverty rate as well as the standards of living are significantly higher than you would in comparison to other countries, right? We tell you that in South Africa there are legislations that exist, corrective legislations that exist post-colonialism to be able to put the previously disadvantaged and marginalized groups in South Africa to be able to give them the platform or preferences in circumstances and situations where they were previously not given recognition, right? We tell you that in South Africa, the legislation recognizes the humanness of the LGBTQIA+ community, which is something that we don't see from all these other countries, right? We're speaking to the point of progression and why South Africa is unique and has an influential position compared to other countries, right? We tell you that we recognize the humanness of these individuals who exist within these communities, and we tell you that women in South Africa, in comparison to all these other countries, are placed at a different perspective, right? They talk about African unity, and we'll tell you throughout my speech, you will understand why South Africa, at the position that it's at, is able to foster the African unity that they are vying for, right? Which goes to show that South Africa is indeed unique and inherently influential, right? Now, we generally regret any kind of circumstances under two situations, right? One, when it's harmful to the progression of society. And we're telling you that South Africa being in the place that it is not inherently harmful. We can see the good that has resulted as a result of South Africa being in the position that it's at, right? What this essentially looks like is that the African continent is exposed to the global landscape, right? We're able to participate in conversations and global politics because of the seat we hold in places such as BRICS, or being the chairperson of the United Nations, or even having the ability to take Israel to the ICJ. That just goes to show that the position and the seat we hold on Africa is a very important and is influential, and it's able to bring the exposure of African continent to the PR.
Yes. Don't you think South Africa would have been better without exclusionism?
I'm not sure I understand why that is important or how it fits in what I'm saying, but I'm placing the burden on you to come and show us why that's important. So, as I was saying, that in the interest of the exposure that this has on the African continent is that we have global superpowers having the interest to then want to, or rather encouraging African global superpowers to want to invest in African countries, because South Africa is placed in a position to be able to have conversations about how there's just a flawed perspective on Africans, not South Africans, of how the flawed perspective exists about South Africans. He mentioned a point about xenophobia. I'm going to tell you that xenophobia exists everywhere. The same way Trump is running his mouth about how there's a white genocide that exists in South Africa, which is completely untrue. We're just telling you that this is an ill-conceived idea that South Africans are killing people and they're just going rampant, pulling their guns out and killing whoever is a foreign national. They just kill them because of the fact that they're foreign national. It's not true. The same way we've seen it not being true with the white genocide that Trump is advocating for, right? So the idea of xenophobia exists everywhere, and it's not something that contributes to South Africa putting themselves at a better scale or thinking that they're better by virtue of being in the position that they hold. If anything, South Africa is advocating for the global African community. We've seen how in the G20 they were able to have topics around sustainability, inclusion, and diversity, which are issues that I never really, I'm going to come to, which are issues that haven't really been touched on these global scales, right? So this just goes to show that it shouldn't be something it's not regrettable to have South Africa in the position that it's at because of the good that has resulted as South Africa being at the place that it's at, right? We are telling you that if it's not going to be harmful to the vulnerable actor, that being the post-colonial countries in Africa, then it's not inherently regrettable, right? Because we see how South Africa prides itself as a regional leader, right? We tell you, I've already mentioned on the idea that they were able to be bold enough to have conversations centered around inclusivity, sustainability, as well as the general diversity, and that just goes to show it's a reflection of Africa as is. Yes.
The G20 and the LGBTQIA community exist outside this narrative. You have no exclusivity beyond this narrative. You can still get legislative change through social movements. We don't see why you need to regret this narrative.
Exactly, we're not regretting it. That's what I've been trying to say the entire time. Thank you for reiterating what I've been saying. Which is exactly what I've been trying to say this entire time, that we are not regretting it, because in as much as they try to tell us that there's no inclusivity, there is, and we've seen how it happens. Other countries, compared to South Africa, are being very violent to members of the LGBTQI+ communities. To exist in such a community is unlawful. To exist in such a community, you will be killed. We've seen how it is legal for people of same-sex genders to be married in South Africa, because we understand the humanness of these people by virtue of being placed in the position that we are, by virtue of being able to understand the humanness and to be able to think and to be conscious about the next person. It places us at a higher scale, hence the influence and us being able, a unique and inherently influential. So the few things that I've touched on my speech is to show you that it's not South Africa being unique or South African exceptionalism is not harmful, it's not inherently harmful to the progression of society. We've seen the good that has resulted from South Africa, or from South African exceptionalism. We've seen how South Africa has been able to foster communication and foster conversation within the global landscape that affect the African community. We've seen how people had then having an interest in Africa as a whole by virtue of South Africa having the balls to be able to speak on conversations that others aren't really speaking on, right? We've shown you that with the exposure or us being a part of the African Union or BRICS, we've seen how there's development within our country, and that's something that we feel like other countries in comparison should be taking notes. Proud.
Thank you to the leader of opposition. The House now recognizes the Deputy Prime Minister. Ready when you are.
Yeah, I start my speech right about now. Sorry, once again. Start. Yeah,
Wait. Stop.
yeah. So, panel regrets motion. What you need to do is assess from the past what necessarily the idea or the narrative has done that is necessarily bad on our side of the bench. You need to assess why it's necessarily a good thing on their side of the bench. But the benefits 00% are not benefits that they got out of the narrative that, exceptionalism is a good thing, right? There are benefits they got out of things like resources, out of things like South Africa's economic capacity. It is not because of the narrative. Everything they prove on BRICS and all the other benefits they give you are not as a result of the narrative that they are the best in Africa and they are the best at large. They are as a result of their economic growth and their resources they have and unique things that they have in their economy that makes them good. It's not the narrative. But then more importantly, we think that the idea that you necessarily sees the thing. South Africa could have been better post the Mandela era, post all those problems that happened within that era, like post-apartheid. The problem then becomes that at the point where you recognize that the exceptionalism has only created a world where South Africa has limited its growth, because it could have probably been a global superpower by now. Because understand something, see, that post-Mandela era was something that was ridiculous, was miraculous. The idea that Mandela was able to easily transition that ridiculous idea of apartheid and bring peace was so beautiful, it was so miraculous, it was a beautiful idea. And it created precedence, it created an idea that South Africa could have been so much more. But right now, there's still issues of xenophobia. It exists within South Africa. Issues of rape. Sisters, women are better in South Africa. Women are raped every day in South Africa. It is not any better now. The problem then becomes that at the point where you need to understand that a lot of things that South Africa could have most likely exploited are largely limited because of the idea that you are better. And so we're not the problem. We talked also earlier in his speech that issues of it is the brothers from the West that are the problem. So they really do not engage true problems that happen within the ground and they evade them. And you have whistleblowers saying things like, oh, it is not us. It is the West people, it is people that are not part of us that invade these problems. You don't have like active involvement in dealing with the problems that happen in South Africa, issues of racism, issues of xenophobia, real problems, rapes. Every time they say, oh, we are better people of South Africans, so it's probably the Ghanaian guy that came in last week that is committing the crimes. They do not engage the real problems that happen within themselves. It makes them evade the real problems that they most likely face. But this is our case and why we most likely think it's more superior. Because secondly, what you do, what that exceptionalism has done, is has created a certain idea that, oh, South Africa is okay, and they do not need any help from the West, like, I mean, from other African countries. When I was coming to South Africa, I expected, like, a very beautiful, like, country, like, so beautiful, like, out of this world. But genuinely, I think Nairobi is better, because I didn't meet the expectations I had of South Africa. The problem with that narrative is that it has created an idea that people in other African countries think that South Africa is that guy, even when South Africa is not that guy. We have no incentive to want to trade with these guys because they most likely are better already, like, will not engage their commodities. But if South Africa was most likely humble, like maybe a China, and they said, well, we're not that guy, even though they know that they are that guy intrinsically, and they don't propagate the narrative, they most likely would have been in a better place. South Africa would have been a global superpower, and it would have made Africa even better and stronger when it comes to dealings with the West. As it stands now, we are still being ridiculed as Africans. That's why Trump can say ridiculous things, even if these guys will not agree, just because he has no incentive to want to put South Africa on the map. Because we kill ourselves with the narrative that we're better even when we haven't gotten there yet. That's the problem. But before I continue my case, closing.
When we come to America, we have this whole idea of like them having an American dream, right? But when we go there, in reality, black people are literally being shot down every day. The same thing is happening in South Africa. Just because you as a person have this misconception, it doesn't mean it's our fault as a country, right? Let's not forget that.
Yeah. So here's the thing with our case, right? The most important part is the fact that you need to engage the world where South Africa is a developing country. It is not there yet. It is still developing. And it's been years after that miraculous post-apartheid era. Tens of years have passed, and South Africa is still developing. The narrative has been there, but South Africa is still developing. It's a middle-income country. We think it could have been better. At the point where you most likely create a world where you say you are that guy when you are not that guy, you limit your growth in that particular regard because you have no important checking mechanisms intrinsically to check you and say, well, you've not gotten there yet. So do better. Engage your systems more. Deal with real problems. You don't do that. At the point where they haven't done that, it has created a world where they are able to really check their systems and check themselves to be able to fight corruption and head against other problems that are significant in making their country a better place. We think SA could have been better, but before I continue, again, come.
We get the fact that SA is a developing country, but in comparison to African countries, we are likely more developed.
So this is the problem. The narrative just says we regret South African exceptionalism. We don't necessarily need to make the comparative with other African countries. We think the comparative can even be the West. I recognize that it's simple. We regret the concept of South African exceptionalism. The idea means that you most likely need to create like a certain world where South Africa could probably be better. That's our case. We think South Africa could have been better than they are now. Even on a global scale, that's the debate on our side. Because we think that South Africa could have done so much more to even match up with superpowers like China and the US and be bargaining on the international tables. That's what they lose out on in a world where they say that they are those guys when they're really not those guys yet. At the point where you limit your growth in that particular regard, we think it's a very terrible thing and something we most likely do not want. Recognize how you most likely, even within the African spaces, you most likely limit these guys because they are unable to grow to that particular extent that they want to grow. If you think I'm lying, go to other African countries and recognize that South Africa isn't even there yet. But at the point where you bring the narrative that you are there, other countries in Africa do not want to engage you. They largely cut you out. That's what's happening in South Africa right now. Because we have no reason to want to engage their commodities in the market. We rather import from China and other countries in that particular regard. At the point where these commodities are equally good and can be something that other African countries can engage with, you limit your markets in that particular regard because you say you are that guy, people do not want to engage you in that particular regard. At the point where we believe that idea, that narrative has largely crippled their economy and has made them very, very apathetic. Very, very unable to really engage the real problems, and that's allowed their systems and their leaders to most likely run away from real problems and just blame it on Western people, like the brothers that go out and come back, and foreigners. We think that it largely limits their ability to grow. We think that South Africa could have been way better than it is right now. We think that the idea has most likely limited them, it has crippled them. If they were probably humble, if they were probably
personal vendetta. Prime Minister says crime in Johannesburg, like giving an extensive of what he was told that was brought by people abroad. That is self-defeating because we think that if that's your mechanization, we think that SA should have, like, their military should be good in terms of ensuring that there is no people that come in. But at a point whereby they lie to you and say, we are not good to these people, but those people are illegal in South Africa. Why are we supposed to be good to them in any instance? But South Africa is good to them, and I'm going to show you when I get into my argumentation. Then he tells you that South Africa is beneath Africa. We don't think that is true. We are more better in comparison to all African countries. It's good for OG to do comparisons, but when we raise, you are not taken, but when we raise a pure about comparisons, there's a pushback. He also tells you that Ghana was the first to obtain dependency, but they don't go around and spread about it. The reason they can't spread about it is because they haven't done anything for the people on the ground. They haven't done anything for other countries in Africa in comparison to SA, and you'll get more analysis into my extensions. They tell you about xenophobia and say that his Pakistan friends was not allowed to come in. I'm going to show you how currently in South Africa we have asylum seekers and who are refugees from Palestine, and there are more protections that are set out by the South African government. DPM says we are not the best. We're not the best. The idea that we are chairing G20 and the African Union, it shows you that we are best because we've got a more better economic state in comparison to other African countries. Your point falls short. Then he also says women are raped in South Africa. But we tell you that the government has passed legislation that identifies GBV as a national disaster. That shows how we essentially are progressive. And a POI would be, are women not raped in Ghana? Because women are raped each and every place. But the idea that the government puts legislation is good. And then he says that SA is not good, and then we must be like China. But China, there's a glamorization of China. It's a world country. We can't be like them. The idea that we have to be like China, it happens when we glamorize the idea of SA. Okay, sharp into my argumentation. South Africa is a regional leader of Africa and one of the best in Africa, and in terms of global politics, economics, and international relations. I think both teams can concede to this, and in essence, states such as South Africa has been able to prevent harms occurring in post-colonial states. Our intervention in Lesotho, Rwanda, and Palestine. These actions are genuinely not harmful at all, and it extends our state being able to prevent individual harms in our African countries that we ought to protect. Also, for instance, when countries who are colonial weapons become addicted to bullying SA, South Africa steps in to free those countries, both financially and psychologically. This happens due to the relation and exceptionalism that SA has. If South Africa does not have that, something like that wouldn't happen. SA is legislative. It is to protect its citizens and African citizens as a whole from self-imposed damage. For example, when Mozambique was having a social unrest, countries like Lesotho, Botswana, and South Africa intervened. But the people in Lesotho and Botswana were chased away. Only South Africa was likely better for the people on the ground. So I don't know why then we should regret this, because currently there is no any social unrest that is occurring in Mozambique. In terms of utilitarian principle, which is a moral framework, the great advantage of this is that it promotes a universal theory. The view of SA being unique and influential to post-colonial African positions, it is able to lead conversations around decolonization, Afrocentric ideologies, and being better for the people on the ground. Post-colonial African nations are still grappling in colonial views in comparison to South Africa. African countries, they are conservative, and they are focused more on religion. SA is the one with religious neutrality. This is good because women and LGBTQI people who have been historically disadvantaged are more likely to become better for the people on the ground, and they are not viewed as secondary bodies. In countries like Uganda and Ghana, which he lies about saying that they are progressive, panel note that Ghana is conservative, and the people who are vulnerable actors are not treated well. Then the exceptionalism of South Africa, being on that specific thing, it ensures that we are likely to become better for the people on the ground. CO raises a very weird POI, saying that how are we likely better for the people on the ground? And then they say to you that social movements are able to do that. But social movements have failed to do that in those African countries, but SA has been able to do it. Sharp, can I take you open?
All right, so the reason you can't win this debate is because there's no direct link between the idea of South African
exceptionalism and all the impacts you preach, especially when other countries do everything you say South Africa is doing, but they are not saying that they are better than every African country for it.
At a point whereby you did not engage us as to which are those African countries or countries that have got post-colonial powers, then you are likely have lost this debate. South Africa advances social change. Tell tells you about legislation. SA is the first country to pass progressive laws such as the broad-based black economic empowerment, identifying people as queer, and we are taking back land, but we don't see other African countries doing that. Why are we principally just? Because this is a just cause. It is a right intention and it is the last resort because it leads to more good than any specific harm. I've shown you in my case which which countries SA has been able to help, but we don't get any pushback from them on that. SA, then besides that, besides taking Israel to court and being more good to the people of Palestine, they are now refugee states and they are in South Africa. They have never been chased away. And what are the legislatives that are there that are passed by South Africa to ensure that there is no xenophobia? SA has not reformed on them because they are going to do more good. They have freedom of movement. They are able to go anywhere. Any Palestinian can walk in this room and none of the South African government or anyone in South Africa can do about that because we identify the idea that they are good people and we need to assist them. They are being protected from expulsion. If a Palestinian walk in here and I'm the one as a South African who becomes somehow, the South African government is going to arrest me. So the idea of xenophobia falls short. They have access to basic rights. They are going to get free education, they are going to get health. That happens through the exceptionalism and the idea that we are principally just. OG is out of this debate. I'm sorry, you've lost round one of PAUDC. Thank you.
Please let's be careful when we're talking about like sensitive issues in the debates. You are allowed to talk about them, but please accord those issues with the sensitivity required. Thank you.
What in terms of what?
Sensitive issues, you know, rape, xenophobia, and the like.
Okay.
Trigger warning to be,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
appreciated. Thank you. The House is ready to recognize, to begin the closing half, the Member of Parliament.
does something similar. It allows South Africa to be the only country that exists within the African continent that receives majority of the aid from the international community, but also it allows for the integration of international financial sectors within the African continent, but it also allows them to basically cement their cultural position as the best within the African continent and better than African states. We think that this is principally harmful, not just for other African states, but also for South African individuals that exist within the state within itself, proud to propose them from CG. What do we then uniquely bring to you as CG? We think both OG and both OO speak symmetrically on issues speaks magically on issues surrounding South African growth, specifically domestically, but also African growth internationally. We think the link that is missing from the opening half specifically is the nature of exceptionalism and how that happens, because that link is important because then that link is important because it's logically prior then to any outcomes that both OG and OO want to claim within their cases. Let's then get into how exceptionalism happens. We think it happens on two spheres. Firstly, let's talk about domestically and how the South African government has propagated this exceptionalism to their citizens. We think it does, we think that through the rise of the ANC government, specifically through the rise of the ANC government post-apartheid, firstly, but secondly, through the ANC apartheid, through the ANC government post-apartheid, rising within their narratives that they're the best, the way in which they dealt with apartheid and the way in which they dealt with the rise of colonialism, they were able to cement that narrative amongst their citizens, right? What does it do? The South African government then had two incentives when they did this. Firstly, they wanted to maintain power within their country, not just domestically, but also regionally. But secondly, they wanted to establish legitimacy then within the continent through this narrative of stability and lack of violence when they dealt with post-colonialism, right? But let's talk about international actors, which I think are also very, very important to understand within this debate, because we think Western actors specifically are the ones that primarily engage with South Africa within this debate. We think that they had two incentives when they also propagated this rise internationally, because this South African exceptionalism narrative also exists worldwide. We think that firstly, they wanted to maintain Western dominance in Africa in some way, shape, or form, and they were able to best do that specifically suit South Africa, because South Africa was the least violent country, I guess, in that terms, in the way in which they dealt with violence. We think that this is important framing then, because if we want to engage the likely counterfactual, it's important to understand that on both sides of the debate, these incentives still exist. The South African government still wants to maintain its prominence, but also the international actors still want to maintain some sort of relevance then within the country. We think then that the counterfactual here is clear. We won't get necessarily South African exceptionalism, but we're likely going to get within its place is the rise of Africa as a whole being prioritized, not just internationally, but also domestically, because of the fact that Western actors still want to have some sort of link towards Africa and towards those Western markets, because they want to challenge the dominance of Eastern narratives and Eastern countries that exist within the African sphere holistically. But through the integration of China and through the integration of Africa that is slowly, through the integration of Russia that is slowly happening within the African continent. We think then that is important then to understand within this debate, because the likely counterfactual is that these incentives still exist, but also the fact that the development of the African sphere as a whole is something that is uniquely prioritized by the South African government, but also by the international Western sphere. Why is that? I bring to you then two extensions. Firstly, on how we're better for South African social progression. Why is this true? This is true for two reasons. Firstly, South Africa gets away internally with many things for two reasons. Firstly, inflation of ANC's performance, right? So the ANC's ability to create and maintain harmful structures and the lack of accountability mechanisms because we specifically inflate the way South Africa was able to deal historically with oppression, which led to individuals then for decades within the South African country change to voting for the ANC government specifically, until recently when individuals wanted to challenge the exceptionalism and the dominance of the ANC specifically then within this narrative. But secondly, we think it happened through branding, through memory, right? So think about Cyril Ramaphosa's tagline, "Task me with your job," and how these campaigns were largely tied to memories of feel-good slogans rather than actual policies on the ground. We think that this is important in this debate because if we want to engage with the counterfactual, then we have to engage with the fact that this narrative largely exists on perception. If individuals are likely on our side of the debate to have a different perspective of the ANC government and how it was able to exist, then they're likely at the very least on our side of the debate able to have unique expectations of the ANC government and how it runs South Africa, but also how it engages in self-intervention. internationally. This is important then because at the very least on our side, we're able to have better accountability mechanisms that exist for the South African government. So we're able to call it out better when it doesn't involve itself in like very oppressive regimes such as in Zimbabwe and in Eswatini when they continued to support those nations regardless, not take it. But also, I think secondly, we're able to just have better structures that exist then in that case. But let's talk about the engagement with international actors. We think that this is currently, the engagement is currently limited to South Africa specifically because of the exclusivity of this narrative. So if all the benefits that OO wants to bring in this debate in terms of South Africa's economic growth and all of that are specifically limited to South Africa precisely because of this narrative that exists within South African exceptionalism, which ties our international actors into engaging with, wanting to engage with South Africa specifically and not other African states. We think then that uniquely on our side, when we didn't have this rise of South African exceptionalism and we had like the counterfactual that exists on our side, when the progression, the development of African states was prioritized, at the very least on our side, we didn't have like aid specifically concentrated to South Africa, but to the entire South African government in of itself. So we don't have the G20 existing alone, South Africa existing alone as the sole actor within the G20, but we largely probably had other countries also being integrated within that development. We think that this exclusively only happens on our side because we don't prioritize South Africa's unique development uniquely, but we also prioritize the development of the African sphere as a whole. Never been prouder to propose.